are refugees and that we must do something about it, both as a nation, the United States, but also the world community. For all of us to be able to get on the same page, for all of us to start to reorient how we think of and how we define refugee would be critical and life-saving for people now, and especially as climate change progresses, unfortunately, for people in the years to come.
That's really great. Thank you so much. I think that's so interesting that you say American perceptions of refugees. I think that's quite true. Professor Huck, if I can turn to you, migration is expensive. We know cross-border migration as climate adaptation is weak without actual climate finance and predictive, safe, and open border policies. At the same time, most mobility is internal, with vulnerable populations and developing countries paying this additional price. You've spoken about loss and damage. Does the international community have an obligation to compensate for any kind of forced displacement?
Thank you very much, Amali, for inviting me here, and it's a great honor to be in this distinguished company. Let me pick up on Congressman Castro's characterization to say that in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we haven't even been able to use the words climate refugees or climate migrants. It's not accepted. So it shows you how dystopian that discussion is. So what do we use? We use a euphemism called loss and damage from climate change, which, we're not allowed to use the words liability and compensation. Those are taboo words. Our lips are sealed. We cannot say liability and compensation. We have to call it loss and damage. Nobody understands. And then under loss and damage, there is this concept of people losing their livelihoods and being forced to be moved. So it's forced displacement because of climate change. Long-winded explanation of climate migration or climate refugees. And I'm at one with Congressman Castro saying that the time has come to accept this, the reality of it. It's happening. It's undeniable, and it's going to get worse if we don't accept it and do something about it. And COP26 is the place to, take the lid off this and say we have to discuss it. It's going to happen. It's happening already, and it's going to get a hell of a lot worse if we don't deal with it now. And so, I come from Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, we are one of the most vulnerable countries. We are predicted to have tens of millions of potential climate migrants, particularly from the low-lying coastal zone of the country. We're hoping most of them will stay inside the country. We're trying to develop a concept called climate resilient, migrant friendly towns so that they can migrate from the rural areas to these towns and not end up in Dhaka city, which is the fastest growing mega city in the world. It won't be able to take in another 10 million potential climate migrants. So we want to distribute them across different towns, keep them in the country. We don't want them going across the borders into other countries, and we want them to stay. So we're trying to figure out ways to deal with this climate migration, which is unfortunately a reality under climate change, and it's going to get worse under climate change. And therefore, we have to get ahead of the problem and start thinking about ways in which we can collaborate. And I feel the United States has a big role to play here in being proactive and not being reactive. They've unfortunately in the past been too reactive on this issue.
Thank you for that, being proactive. I like that a lot. Ambassador Verveer, thank you so much for being here. Structural inequality, particularly on the basis of gender, which I know you have spent, is your life's work really, heightens the impacts of climate change on women and girls. Yet they and other marginalized groups still lack adequate voices in leading the decisive issues. Our recent calls by Bangladesh and others for a UN Special Rapporteur on climate change and human rights, one of the ways we can close this gap? If so, how can countries like the US support this effort?
Well, thank you, Amali, and it's so good to be with you, and thank you for everything that climate refugees do. And I think it's really quite serendipitous, if you will, that we started with Congressman Castro talking about the fact that climate refugees are not recognized, and then having the professor give us the exact understanding of the convention. because it is true, refugees currently apply to those who are being persecuted or escaping war. And yet, as you started this program, huge numbers increasingly are being displaced, and they have nowhere to go in terms of the international frameworks. So Congressman Castro, good luck. We really need to update what you are involved in. In terms of the issue of this incredible vulnerability that the Climate Vulnerability Forum that Professor and I were talking about informally before this started, which involves those exceptionally impacted countries, mostly in the global south, the Pacific Islands, Bangladesh for sure, who are tremendously adversely impacted by climate. I remember years ago being in PNG, and a panel of women leaders from the islands were introducing themselves. And the one from Tuvalu said, "We will be the first islands to go underwater." And there's something about the proximity of a statement like that that should move us all. But with what's happening in our world today, maybe we're all becoming more aware of these vulnerabilities. So I would say in that context, as you pointed out, that among the most vulnerable are certainly women, that climate impacts everybody for sure, but it disproportionately impacts women, particularly those who are affected by their socioeconomic status. And yet they have the primary responsibilities for food, for water, for the stuff of life. And they are increasingly made vulnerable by the environment in which they find themselves through no fault of their own. So I think just as we are coming to grips with the fact that climate is a security issue, we really need to emphasize climate as a human rights issue, because the impacts of climate deprive a human being of his or her exercise of their human rights. And the climate solutions are formulated often without any human rights lens being applied to those solutions, and without the participation of the people most significantly impacted. And this has to be reversed. We have to get the human rights considerations on the international agenda more significantly, whether it's through a UN rapporteur on climate and human rights or in other ways, but clearly it's necessary. And I think also to understand that women's vulnerability poses huge barriers because of the lack of inclusion for them, and because the challenges that they confront are not really understood. And similarly, the counterpart to that is we see them as victims, and they are victimized by climate and their status, but they are leaders and they are problem solvers, and we have to factor their participation in to climate solutions.
Well said. They're often the ones who actually find the resiliency for the survival until there are so-called solutions. Thank you for that. Congressman Castro, I'll return to you. Maybe we'll talk about some root causes. There's a lot of discussion about addressing the root causes of Central American migration to the US border. While the Biden-Harris administration strategy includes climate change as a root cause and seeks to build resilience and adaptation, we have not seen much focused attention in this area. What more must the United States and other countries in the region do to address climate-driven migration?
Oh, well, how far back do you want to start, right? I mean, we still have challenges, even in our own country, of people accepting that climate change is real, but you also have some of that skepticism in parts of Latin America. You need greater cooperation between the United States and the nations of Latin America and the Caribbean. These are parts of the world that every year are hit by natural disasters, by severe weather events. And I want to give you, just because I think it's illustrative for Americans, you know, every year, every other year, you always hear about a hurricane that's approaching the Gulf Coast. And I remember not too long ago, one of those storms, as it was approaching, I was driving on I-10, and you can take Interstate 10 from Houston, near the coast, into my hometown of San Antonio. And I noticed it was nighttime, that there were cars, rows of cars parked basically off the highway. And I believe those cars were essentially had come from the coast and were just waiting out what they believed would be a short storm period. Because Houston over the years has been hit hard by severe weather events. And so, that to me was something that was illustrative in our own nation. And that's a nation that has among the best infrastructure in the world, right? And so when we think about what needs to be done to partner with other countries, sustainability, also, as Melanne said, listening to local voices. A lot of our development efforts over the years have been top down, so to speak. We have insisted on being in control of the minutia of many things. We need to be able to work with local partners and truly take their guidance and use their understanding to guide our own efforts at sustainability. So all of these things, it's got to be a greater priority. There's got to be greater cooperation, and we've got to be able to work together to solve this issue.
Love that. Local partners, exactly. Ambassador Verveer, seemingly the recent U.S. root causes strategy for Central America that Congressman Castro was just also speaking about, it lacks mention of women, indigenous groups, marginalized communities as partners to engage towards solutions. Do you agree? I mean, with that characterization that I've just posed, and if so, as the Congressman was just saying, what must we do differently, and how, what does that look like?
Amali, I felt the same way when the policy was announced, and it was discouraging because as a strong supporter of the administration, and I particularly grateful for the emphasis on climate and the new leadership that has been exemplified in that, and the fact that we are mainstreaming climate through all of the agencies of government, as well as mainstreaming gender in terms of climate. And when you look at the Northern Triangle in particular, which has been the source of many who are increasingly displaced, look at the conditions. As the Congressman said so eloquently, it's an area that is attacked consistently by extreme weather, a lot of horrific hurricanes that destroy everything, but also drought conditions. And it's a largely agrarian area for particularly the poor and those economically stressed. And today they can't even eke out an existence because the land is no longer arable and they have no recourse. So the only opportunity they have in terms of their desperation is to move. And however that journey goes, it starts with internally displaced, and it may go beyond because of the conditions. So we have to see climate's role along with poverty, along with gang warfare and what that represents as part of this holistic understanding of what is driving this displacement. And I would just say, again, building on what was said, that resilience will occur if there is participation locally in terms of understanding, again, women's role as agents of change, as agents trying to make a difference. We need, I think, less emphasis on hard security and more emphasis on human security in order to ensure that we tap the local knowledge that resides in the people, their recommendations, and as the Congressman said, to listen to them, not to just come in with whatever we think the solution of the moment is. There's an old saying, an Indonesian saying, that you need heat at the top and you need heat at the bottom. We need to bring the heat up at the bottom to better inform these policies.
I like that. I'm gonna remember that one. Congressman Castro, I'm going to come back to you because I know you do have other duties that are going to call you away. So you have pushed for the United States to be a leader in providing protection for climate refugees. What are your thoughts on how US immigration policy should change to reflect the increasing complex drivers of forced migration today, namely climate-related events? And of course, anything else you'd like to comment on before you have to leave us?
Sure. Well, US law should include climate change as a basis for refugee status. Ultimately, I think that's one of our main goals. I mentioned earlier that I've been having many conversations with members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but also other colleagues in Congress about taking on this issue of climate refugees. And others in Congress have as well been working very hard also. So there's a group of us that have been really pushing this. And, I feel like we're still, unfortunately, in the initial phases of this awareness and gaining acceptance for this idea that somebody who's fleeing a climate situation is a refugee. So we're going to have to continue pushing that within Congress, in the House and the Senate, also in the administration. Before President Biden went to the last G7 summit, I had led a letter with many legislators asking him to press this as a main issue at the G7. And so we've got to make sure that we keep pounding that drum. It's also an important reason that the Build Back Better agenda is crucial in that $3.5 trillion proposed bill. Now, I know there's a lot of debate about what the final number is going to be, but about $700 billion of that is to combat climate change, both long-term and short-term strategies, and working with international partners to do it. And so to me, that is a strong, important, and assertive step that the United States can take on combating climate change and, in the long run, reducing the number of climate refugees. But also, I think, by delving into that work and into those discussions, accepting that people who are fleeing climate change are, in fact, refugees. And I think ultimately that would also help to update our own thinking about what it means to be a refugee in 2021 and beyond. And I apologize that I've got to leave y'all, but thank you so much, all of you, for all of your incredible work. Please know that people in Congress, the policymakers, are listening, and please keep reaching out.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We
Keep
really
it up.
appreciate it. Yes, keep it up is right. And anything we can do as well, Congressman, we're all here and I guess advocates together. So
thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much for your time, sir. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so, and then there were three. Well, this is great. I'm already just enjoying this conversation so much. Professor Huck, it seems to me then that we need to make some significant shifts in how we frame this topic, which I think, the Congressman has been speaking about, so is Ambassador Verveer, as a problem for states to a problem for people.
Mm-hmm.
How can we ensure that migrants and the most vulnerable people to climate displacement have a fair and representative say in global governance frameworks?
Great, thank you very much. So, Amali, perhaps you can just call me Saleem from now on. We can drop the titles and talk as friends.
Nothing if not respectful.
Excellent, excellent. So, the conversation so far, particularly from the ambassador and from the congressman, is music to my ears, because I've spent the last 20 years working with the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries, helping them to, first of all, learn about climate change and then figure out what they can do and help them to adapt to them. And I would say that in particular in my country, Bangladesh, although Bangladesh is very well known as one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, that's actually a very old story. It's a decade and a half old story. We've known that for a long time, and we haven't been sitting idle. We've been taking actions to prepare ourselves and to make ourselves more resilient. And in fact, in a very real sense, we have something to offer both the United States of America and the countries in Central America on how to adapt to the impacts of climate change. We've been doing it for quite a while. And the ambassador is quite right. the key ingredient is empowering the local communities themselves, recognizing their own abilities, recognizing their own agency, recognizing their own understanding of their problems, and then listening to them and responding to their requirements, not just having a top-down assessment and solution that we bring to them as so-called beneficiaries, or even worse, targets of our charity. That doesn't work. They need to be part of the solution making. They need to be part of the decision making. They need to be part of the implementation. And the area of adaptation that I work on is essentially that. We call it locally led adaptation. The local adapters are the ones who know how to adapt. They're the ones suffering. If they don't die, they've adapted. They survived. They may not know all the terminology that we are using. It's arcane language to them. But the reality of dealing with the climatic impacts, whether it's a flood or a hurricane, they know, they're doing it. And we need to be learning from them. We need to be helping them. And in a very real sense, the rich countries don't have an advantage in knowledge of adaptation. Poor people in poor countries actually have a much greater history of dealing with this, knowing how to deal with it. That comes to the fore and can be shared with even rich countries like the United States. And so to me, sharing that experiential knowledge of local people, women as well as men, and particularly women, I agree entirely with the ambassador here, they need to be prioritized, is a win-win for all countries. The US will benefit from Bangladesh. It's not just the US helping Bangladesh anymore. And particularly around climate migrants, it is a global problem. We have to work both ends of the spectrum, where they're coming from and where they're going. And if we can do that, I think the solutions are possible. We just need to be looking at it in an integral manner, which we're not at the moment. We're just, seeing it as a security threat and a problem that has to be avoided, whereas it's unavoidable. We're going to have to deal with it.
Wow, you said so many things there that were just like epic quotes. Wow, thank you. I mean, it's so true what you say about the resiliency that comes from poverty and how much one learns from that. That in itself, there's so much there to unpack. Thank you for that. So Ambassador Verveer, climate change, you mentioned security earlier. Climate change is often discussed as a threat multiplier. Equally, I've heard it very aptly said, I read this beautiful article where it was said that climate change is an injustice multiplier because it accelerates other deprivations and drivers of movement. A recent report shows a critical link between climate-induced migration and modern slavery, trafficking, forced labor, early forced marriage, where women and girls and already vulnerable groups are at heightened risk. What anticipatory actions can we be taking to safeguard these populations?
Well, first of all, I think it's both a threat multiplier and a injustice multiplier. They go together in many ways. We have been working on at Georgetown the nexus between climate, gender, displacement, and conflict, because as the displacement occurs because of the grinding poverty and impact that leads to those social horrors that you just described in terms of human trafficking or early marriage, those are the places where those who want to take advantage, take advantage of those who are in desperate situations come in and wreak even more havoc, multiply, if you will, the injustice already in their own lives. But in terms of the threat multiplication and what we do about it, I think we really have to go and look at the roles that women in particular need to be playing and need to be recognized to be playing. The major conversation today, fully understood in terms of carbon emissions and where all of the emphasis is and who the biggest offenders are, that is, true. But the reality is there are millions and millions of people who are severely impacted, who are not part of the conversation and not really seen as part of the solution. And I really find that very unnerving because we are not bringing in to this world of solutions that kind of local leadership, if you will. So I would just mention a few things that are based on many of the case studies that we have done that focus on women as agents of change, as opposed to just vulnerable victims, understanding they are vulnerable and they are victimized, but they are leaders. And that's where the understanding doesn't come in. Think of the role that so many women in these societies play as farmers. The smallholder farmers, the great majority in many countries, are women. They are, in many ways, half of the agriculture workforce. We know what carbon does in terms of emissions in agriculture. We know women also tend livestock, the role of methane and livestock. But where are we seeing the women recognizing that as leaders in regenerative agriculture, as people to whom technology that can be absolutely essential in these roles is provided so that they can be more efficient? Think of conservation and the role that it plays in absorbing the carbon. Just so many of these mitigative actions that could be taking place where women are ignored in that equation. And I think land rights has to be right up there as one of the key issues that has to be dealt with in this respect. So agents of change, they can have tremendous and will have if they are participatory in this process. Secondly, one of the key things we know, every country, renewable energy, clean energy, ways that energy is going to be provided that isn't going to contribute to worsening the climate problems. Again, this is a critical role that women can play. I think of Bangladesh, Saleem, in terms of the installation of tens of thousands of solar panels. I think
That's
it was
right.
Grameen that was
That's
a
right.
leader in that. Just a tremendous role that poor women have played in terms of renewable energy. I think of cook stoves, millions, billions actually, around the world are cooking in these dirty cook stoves that spew black carbon into the environment. When you're in a situation where this is the case, as is much of the developing world, you immediately find yourself with your throat hurting, your eyes burning, and this is what's going on every day in these lives. Besides contributing to their health and their family's health in a negative way, it's also sending that black carbon into the air. And these technological changes, whether they're the solar panels, whether they're mini electric grids, whether they're clean cook stoves, we know these are all solutions through technology that can be adapted to mitigate the problem that we all have. And yet they are not understood. Women are not understood to be key players in all of this. But secondly, it is a way to economically empower them. I have sat with women in India who, went on in a dialect I couldn't understand as they were describing their cook stove. And this woman was so animated. I said, you could be selling those. And everybody burst out laughing until they translated, because she was selling them. All of the women in that room had a viable economic livelihood based on technological apparatus that can also affect climate. So the whole economic empowerment and what that would do to raise up women in these situations. And then thirdly, when those barriers to their inclusion are lifted, and they must be lifted so that they can participate, they are extraordinary resource managers. That's what they do in perhaps a less sophisticated way. They can create resilient communities. They can reduce the kind of conflicts that begin to happen locally. We are missing a huge opportunity in adaptation and mitigation because we are not focusing on these safeguards in a priority way that could really make a difference. And we really need to be rethinking the way that we're solely looking at some of the ways to address climate change.
Yeah, I'm hearing you both say, locally led adaptation solutions, and then the role of women and how much there is there to harness that you just so wonderfully just demonstrated there, Ambassador. Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, a lot there. Thank you for that. So turning to a slightly different question, Professor Huck, or Saleem. I read a really interesting article recently where James Gustav Speth, the climate scientist, said, quote, "The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that." Now, clearly, you're a scientist. You've been doing this work and more for a very long time. I think maybe you do. Love to hear your thoughts on how we get to a transformation.
Sure. So I consider myself, primarily a human being and then a scientist. So the first category is something that we all share with each other, no matter where we come from. And that, to me, is a huge foundation for us to take forward. But if I can just digress a little bit in terms of the role of women and share the situation from my country, Bangladesh, which, we are now celebrating our 50th year as an independent country. And when we became an independent country 50 years ago in 1971, the then Secretary of State of the United States, Henry Kissinger, thought we were going to end up being a basket case. Bangladesh would not survive as a country. 50 years later, we have not only survived, we have done quite well in that period. And one of the biggest returns on investment has been educating our young girls. Our girls, even in a conservative Muslim society, our girls go to school, they were educated, they're in the workforce, they are the ones who did the 7 million households, by the way, Ambassador, now have solar home systems on their roofs. And these women are selling them and putting them in place and repairing them. And the house, the quality of life in the house with a lamp, a light after dark, it has a huge difference in the quality. When they used to have a little, kerosene lamp, they couldn't study, the kids couldn't do their homework. Now they have a light. They can go to the bathroom, they can walk around, they can watch television. It has an enormous change in the quality of life of these poor people, poor households. They can afford it, they buy it, they get repaired, they sell it. And so, women have transformed our country. And in the future, with the climate change problem emerging, I argue, and I've been writing about this in Bangladeshi newspapers, that the next generation of girls will solve the climate problem for us as well, if we can educate them properly about this. And they are getting educated and they're getting to learn about this and they're working. And so to come back to your question, to me, the future lies with our young people. I see tremendous energy, tremendous willingness to learn, and willingness to forego the past. The past is not written in stone. We can change things. The kids know that. The kids want to do that. Every Friday, school kids from all over the world come out of school and they demonstrate together, inspired by the teenager Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who started the movement all alone. She'd sit in front of the parliament on Friday with a placard all by herself. And now millions of school kids are coming out and organizing themselves. In fact, they had a very interesting youth pre-COP summit in Milan just a few days ago. I wasn't able to go myself, but I followed it very closely. And I was tremendously impressed by what these kids were doing. They really get it. They really want to do something. They're the ones who will energize their leaders and politicians to do something. But as the ambassador says, we have to warm from the bottom up as well as from the top down. And from the bottom, I see, the sense of solidarity and humanity in the school kids is something that we need to be looking at. How do we enhance that, enable that? And I personally work on, as I said, on locally led adaptation. I am trying to develop a network of local adapters to climate change all over the world, including in the United States. In Miami, in New York, you had the floods in New York recently. There's local adaptation taking place everywhere in the world, and the local people who are affected by climate change are figuring out what to do. And I try to connect them. I have a platform called Gobeshona, which is a Bangla word for research, and we connect people from all over the world. And one of the unintended benefits, if you like, of the pandemic is that everybody's now comfortable in this Zoom world, in this virtual world, and we can talk to each other, and we do quite regularly, and learn from each other. And so there are two big lessons that I'd like to share. Firstly, while every place is unique and the situation is unique, you can't deny that. Nevertheless, there are a lot of things that are transferable, that can be shared and learned with each other. And one of the things that is almost a truism, no matter where it is, whether it's in a poor country or in a rich country, is that the primary victims of the impacts of climate change in any place are the poorest people of that place. It's the slum dwellers in the cities in New York. They're the ones who lost their lives, by the way, the ones who lived in basements who got flooded. And this is the same thing with the COVID-19 impacts. The people of color, slum dwellers in cities, poor people in the rural areas, Native Americans in the US, and so on, everywhere. That everywhere, if you want to see who is the most vulnerable, it's the poorest people in any given country. And so one of the problems that they all share is, how do you influence higher level decision makers when you don't have power and influence? All right. And we can share stories. How did you do this? How did we do it? How did this group in Mumbai do it, and this group in New York do it? And that's powerful, sharing stories of actions that people were able to do by collective action or by organizing. There are a whole variety of things that can be done and are being done. And to me, that's where the hope lies. I don't have hope in the leaders anymore. The leaders have shown that they are always behind the ball. They're never ahead of the problem. We push them. We hope the congressman is able to do that in his sphere, but we can't depend on them anymore. We have to start moving ourselves. And to me, people-to-people exchanges, solidarity, getting to know each other, getting to work together, finding ways to collaborate and work together is where the future lies in tackling climate change. It's such a big problem. We can't just wait for leaders to come together once a year and talk about it. That just hasn't worked. We're going to have to do things every day. And I'd be very happy to, after this is over, find ways to talk further about how all of us might be able to collaborate going forward.
Yes, that's fantastic. I'd love to hear more about this platform that you mentioned as well. I'm going to, I know we have a lot of questions, and I'm going to allow Anna to take over in just a minute and ask a few questions. I know one question everybody probably has is, what can everybody do? What can everyday, any capacity, what can people do? I'll start with that while Anna also brings you some other questions.
Well, and you're starting with me, I guess, on that one. But I just wanted to say, listening to Saleem, Bangladesh has been blessed with a lot of social entrepreneurs who have done tremendous transformative thinking that we have then, in many other places, tried to replicate. Your words about the next generation, I think, are right on. But one of the things I find I'm asked all the time is what's working? Because people really want to know, particularly in these kinds of situations, what is working and what can we try to do in our situation? You mentioned that you're collecting these local solutions. We're doing case studies on some that we know about. I think we need to find a way to aggregate these so that people aren't having to ask what's working. They immediately can determine what it is and whether or not they can do something similar. So in terms of what can we do, I think that question has to be answered on many levels. First of all, I think there is momentum now, whether it's the realization that the fires that we're experiencing in the United States in the Northwest, or the floods we've had in the Midwest, or the kinds of recent flooding in New York that Saleem talked about, where people literally lost their lives in basement apartments because of the infrastructure work that needed to be done that wasn't done. I think it's given greater visibility to the fact that this is a serious problem. There will always be those deniers, but I think it's changing significantly. Secondly, we know time is running out. And from the studies that the UN and others the scientists have been providing, we really need to act before it truly is too late. And those bright young people coming up won't even be able to have a chance to create those greater solutions. So I think we need this on many levels. I think we need it on the international level. And because I focus so much on gender, I'll just say with the COP coming up and with the UN FCCC's work in putting climate on the international agenda and trying to move us all in a certain direction, that there have been over the years tremendous efforts to try to, and through decisions that have been made, to make sure that gender responsive policies that were adopted, gender action plans in what member states have put together in terms of what they are trying to do in the contributions that they're making to climate mitigation. So internationally, we have to do better because we have articulated, passed, put in place lots of great policies that sound good, but there's been very little implementation comparatively. And that's going to take advocacy to move that. And similarly, if you go by country, the responsibilities that the countries have to enact those kinds of policies and act on them, as I had said earlier about what the Biden administration is going to do. We have legislation being debated right now. We don't know how it's going to turn out. It has a huge climate component. Whether it will pass or not remains to be seen. But again, advocacy would make a considerable difference if those actors, those decision makers, were hearing that this is important. I think humanitarian organizations, and again, I go back to Bangladesh, Saleem, where they are dealing with environmental degradation. For example, in Cox's Bazar, they've installed clean cook stoves to begin to get at some of that environmental degradation. Think about the development agencies and the role that they play, certainly in terms of climate increasingly, but just as many of us worked very hard to make sure a gender lens was applied to development priorities because it would create more effective outcomes, we need to ensure that in terms of climate policies as well that are developed in the whole world of development. Work with the private sector. There is something that many of the companies in the United States are engaged in called ESG, environment, social governance, huge climate components. efforts to make their own companies more sustainable based on better climate policies, but also more broadly. You know, in the United States, with the previous administration, we were climate deniers from an official position, but it was the states, the localities, and the private sector that kept pushing addressing the climate issues. So all of these actors make a difference. Supply chains, what are companies doing about their supply chains, and what's happening in terms of addressing climate and sustainability? In the food, the food sector, what are they doing in terms of supporting regenerative agriculture, for example, and working with the poor farmers so that they are not working on land that is increasingly not going to be arable. And then, you know, you can keep going through all of society, and it will come down to each of us. I know people who have given up eating, you know, beef or lamb or whatever, and they're all plant-based. I know young people who are mounting campaigns and doing what they can. It is going to take everybody. And that's why I think the solution is not singularly based. It is international, it is national, it is local, and everybody has to be involved, even those who may think that climate isn't going to affect them tomorrow. It's already affecting them.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Ambassador Verveer. So our last and final question to both of you: what brings you all hope for a justice-oriented future for climate displaced people, both internally and across borders?
Let me take that question first, Ambassador. Give her a chance to take a breath. And I'll build on what Melanne has said, if I might be so informal. I agree with you entirely. So let me rephrase it in the way that I like to do, which is to say that climate change is a global problem that really makes us have to think of ourselves, each of us, wherever we happen to be, as global citizens. We are citizens of planet Earth now first, and citizens of America or Bangladesh or wherever else second now, because that is really the overarching issue that we need to be addressing. And in that framing, we need to think of ourselves as part of the solution. We are also part of the problem if our carbon footprint happens to be much bigger than the average, and I'm pretty sure everyone on this call falls in that category. We should be doing what we can to reduce it. You know, stop eating meat if that's something we want to do. You know, turn off the lights, cycle, bike instead of a car. Whatever we can do, we should do. I mean, I take personal responsibility for that. I don't own a car, by the way. I take you know, public transport whenever I can, and so starting from doing things oneself, but then obviously doing it oneself is not going to be the scale that is needed. So we need to go beyond taking actions ourselves to collective action, working with others. And that is depending on where you happen to be, where you live, where you work, talk to your family, talk to your friends, talk to your co-workers, see whether they're interested. If not, make them interested, go on demonstrations, go on marches, you know, lobby your congressman or your senator or your politicians, and take collective action. And then finally, take global action. Now we can take global action. You don't have to be confined to your own geography where you happen to be located. You can connect with the rest of the world. And in particular, I say this, I talk a lot to, you know, university. I'm a university professor, so I get invited to give lectures to young students in developed country universities all the time. And I tell them, I said, one of the things that you need to do, what I just said, you need to do all these things yourself, but you also need to reach out to the victims of your pollution around the world, okay? You will not be able to reduce your pollution to zero. You should reduce as much as you can, but you can't reduce it to zero. And so you should take some responsibility, because pollution is not a victimless crime. There are victims of your pollution around the world. And I happen to be living in a country in Bangladesh where there are millions of them. So if you're interested in getting in touch with them, I can put you in touch with them. And they don't want your money, by the way. It's not about just giving money. It's about your solidarity. It's about your empathy. It's about your connecting with them as human beings and figuring out with them, how can you work together to solve this global problem, and communicating with them. So to me, that is an opportunity that we have just begun to scratch in terms of making it a political force globally, and having actions actually have consequences and outcomes, good outcomes and good consequences. I firmly believe we can do it, and that's what I do.
Well, you're more than doing your part, clearly, and I'm not sure there's much to add because you've been so inclusive and comprehensive at the same time. But I would just make one point at the risk of beating a message that I am accused of constantly doing, and that is recognizing the role of half the world's population on this climate issue. I once was in a discussion in a developing country and meeting with a group of women, and the first one said to me, "Stop looking at us as victims and look at us as the leaders that we are." And I hope that we can tap all of that potential, all of that ability, even among poor people, and understand they have a vital role to play if we're going to turn this terrible calamity around. And so I would just say that my great hope is that more of us will realize that more and more, and that we'll see this kind of integration into our overall climate policies at whatever level.
Wow, thank you so much to both of you. I just really love how much you've shared from the heart today. That really is ultimately what resonates with all of us. And I mean, from my very limited experience compared to yours, what you both say is exactly what I've heard refugees and displaced communities say. I mean, you know, Melanne, I've said the same to you about women refugees who've said, talk to us, we can tell you what we need here and what those outcomes are, because we don't have what we need, you know, or what resiliency really looks like. So just thank you so much for sharing your life's work with us. It's been a tremendous honor. Is the best way that people can stay in touch with your work and the sharing that you have offered, is that through your Twitter handles, which we very happy to share in the chat?
Also, looking at the website and
Georgetown,
communicating through the website.
Okay, we can do that. And for you, Saleem, it would be your Twitter handle.
Yep, that's right. Okay. Yes.
All right, great.
And we'll be happy to follow up by email as well if you wanted to follow up on these conversations. I always like to follow up.
That is so generous.
And to climate refugees, continued success.
Indeed, indeed, wonderful.
It's really just that's too kind and generous. And you know, Ambassador Verveer, now so many years ago, invited me to a very special meeting at Georgetown, and Professor Huck has also been such a support. And honestly, talk about resiliency in your work, but also how generous you've been with that resiliency to people like me, to people like Anna, to people here who are listening. So we all thank you. We thank Congressman Castro as well, who has devoted his life to such righteous pursuit of human rights, and we thank all of you. There are connections, chats, social media and websites and all the ways that you all can stay in touch with all of us here today. Please do stay in touch, because as you heard everybody say, this is very much a collective work. There is, as Ambassador Verveer said, we have to do all of it. That means we have to do a little bit of everything. Locally led solutions where we are being very specific to include severely impacted people as part of the solutions, which is so true, is hugely lacking. Women as agents of change, the role of youth in engagement, the role of advocacy. There's much more I could say to summarize this, but we'll be in touch with next steps. And we thank you all for joining us today. And until next time.
Thank you very much. Right.
Saleem.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.